A teenage couple told their parents they were headed to a popular campground, but instead drove into Vermont's remote wilderness for a secret weekend getaway. For 3 agonizing months, their families had no answers as the trail went completely cold. Then, a state contractor stumbled upon their abandoned campsite and found an unusual empty candy wrapper that would prove to be the start of a much darker mystery. One that involved more than just 2 lost teenagers. This is a story of a disappearance, a frantic search, and a discovery that revealed a terrifying secret hidden in plain sight. Watch until the end to find out what happened to the missing teenagers. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more true crime stories. Let us know in the comments where you are watching from. 17-year-old Emily Chen and 18-year-old Jack Riley were due back from a camping trip in Sequoia National Park on Sunday evening. Their parents, 2 sets of friends who had known each other for years, had been hesitant about the trip. The idea of the young couple spending a night alone in the woods was unsettling. But Jack, with his confident demeanor and experience as a scout, had assured both sets of parents they were heading to a well-staffed campground, a place teeming with families and park rangers. They had eventually agreed. Now, calls to both Emily's and Jack's cell phones went straight to voicemail. In the patchy service areas of the Sierra Nevada mountains, this wasn't immediately a cause for alarm. But as the afternoon wore into evening, the lack of contact became ominous. By 9 p.m., the anxiety tightening in the parents' chests became unbearable. They had to act. Jack's father decided to drive out to the campground himself, envisioning a flat tire, a dead battery, a simple explanation. The drive was long and winding. When he arrived at the campground entrance, the check-in booth was staffed, the end of the busy season approaching. He approached the park ranger on duty, his voice strained as he explained the situation. The ranger, accustomed to the anxieties of parents, calmly checked the registration logs. Jack Riley wasn't there. Emily Chen wasn't there. They had never checked in. The father drove the loops of the campground himself, his headlights sweeping across the campsites, searching for Jack's familiar older model pickup. It wasn't there. No tent, no campfire, no sign of them at all. The realization was a physical blow. Jack and Emily had lied. They had intentionally gone somewhere else. If they weren't here, where were they? The wilderness of Sequoia National Park is vast, rugged, and even in late summer, unpredictable. The initial missing persons report was filed with the Inyo County Sheriff's Office. The father's desperate account of his son's empty promises and the unsettling discovery at the campground set in motion a search that was both immediate and frustratingly vague. The deputy on duty, a veteran with a weary face, took down the details. He knew from experience that a day or two often resolve these cases. Young people get caught up in the moment, lose track of time, or simply forget to call. But the lack of any trace at the designated spot, the outright lie, added a layer of complexity he couldn't ignore. This wasn't a case of a delayed homecoming. It was a case of an unknown destination. The first 48 hours were a blur of coordinated effort. Law enforcement, assisted by park rangers, began a preliminary search. They focused on known trailheads and remote campsites, places where a couple seeking solitude might go. They used every available resource, from mounted patrols to a small 2-seater observation plane that flew low over the dense forest canopy. The search grid was a massive, ever-expanding web of possibilities, and with each passing hour, the size of the area to be covered grew exponentially. The parents, frantic with worry, were sequestered at the local sheriff's station, providing photos, descriptions, and any small detail they could recall from the last time they saw the teenagers. A brand of sneakers, a favorite hat, a half-joking comment about getting lost, The smallest fragments of information became precious, fueling the hope that a simple clue would surface and point them in the right direction. But nothing did. The search turned up empty. The pickup truck, a rusty 10-year-old Ford Ranger, was nowhere to be found. Its absence was a chilling reminder that they hadn't just gotten lost on foot. They had vanished with their vehicle. The search was extended to the network of unpaved logging roads and fire service trails, but the forest seemed to swallow any trace of them whole. The vast, mountainous terrain of the park was a labyrinth of towering sequoias and deep canyons. It was a place that could conceal 100 vehicles and 1,000 secrets. The initial wave of public interest, fueled by local news outlets, quickly faded. A few online posts, a handful of concerned comments. The story of two young people who might have simply run away wasn't enough to sustain national headlines. As days turned into a week and a week into a month, the search was officially scaled back. The active, on-the-ground efforts were replaced by a cold case file. The parents, however, refused to give up. They hired a private investigator, a former law enforcement officer named David Miller, who had a reputation for finding what others had missed. Miller was a quiet, meticulous man. He began his work by re-interviewing everyone, from the park ranger to the teenagers' friends. He learned that the couple's relationship, while seemingly perfect on the surface, had been fraught with recent tension. Emily, a bright and ambitious student, had been accepted into an out-of-state university. Jack, a free spirit with a passion for the outdoors, had a more uncertain future. There were whispers of arguments, disagreements about their future together. Miller considered the possibility of a lover's quarrel gone wrong, a terrible accident, or a planned elopement. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The lie about the campground was too deliberate, the disappearance too complete. It wasn't a reckless choice. It felt like a calculated move, a move with a purpose. Miller knew that the answer wasn't in the dense forest. It was in the details of their lives, and he was determined to find it. Despite weeks of searching and dozens of dead ends, the investigation lost momentum, and the search officially shifted into a cold case. 4 months passed in a desolate blur for the parents. The initial heart-wrenching hope of a simple runaway case had slowly been replaced by a gnawing dread. Emily and Jack's faces, once vibrant and smiling in family photos, now stared out from missing posters, their images fading in the sun and rain. The case had gone cold. The private investigator, David Miller, had exhausted every lead he could find. He had traced their digital footprints, checked bank accounts which remained untouched, and interviewed every friend, acquaintance, and classmate. Nothing. It was as if they had simply ceased to exist. Then a breakthrough, not from Miller's tireless work, but from a chance encounter. A state contractor, flying a routine aerial survey of the park to monitor for signs of disease in the trees, noticed an anomaly. Deep in a rarely visited rugged section of the park, a flash of bright orange caught his eye. It was a patch of color out of place in the monochromatic green and brown of the forest floor. He marked the coordinates and reported the sighting to the Park Service, who in turn contacted the sheriff's office. A small team of investigators, including a forensic specialist, was dispatched to the location. The hike in was difficult, traversing steep inclines and a thick undergrowth of manzanita and oak. The orange flash turned out to be a brightly colored pop-up tent, the kind favored by weekend campers. It was Emily and Jack's. The scene was eerily untouched. The tent was still pitched, the flap slightly ajar. A small campfire pit was filled with cold ashes, a few charred logs remaining. Inside the tent, 2 sleeping bags were neatly rolled. Their backpacks were there, except for one. Emily's was missing. Everything else, a small stove, a cooler with uneaten cans of soda, and a collection of Jack's fishing gear, was exactly as it would have been if they had just stepped out for a walk. But there were no footprints, no signs of a struggle. The silence of the forest was absolute. The forensic specialist began a meticulous examination. He cataloged every item, carefully dusting for prints, though he held little hope of finding any on the rough surfaces. The one truly baffling discovery was a small, torn piece of a topographical map. It had been folded and tucked into the corner of Jack's sleeping bag. The map showed a section of the park, but 2 locations were circled in red ink. One of the circles marked the exact location of the campsite. The other, however, pointed to a remote, almost inaccessible area deep within the mountains, far from any established trail. This discovery changed everything. It proved the couple had deliberately gone off-grid. They hadn't just gotten lost. They had a plan. This wasn't a random disappearance. The missing backpack and the cryptic map suggested a destination, a rendezvous, a next step in a journey that had been abruptly interrupted. But by whom or what? The investigation, now with a new sense of urgency, shifted its focus from a search for 2 missing persons to a criminal investigation of what was now presumed to be a crime scene. Investigators, with the guidance of the private detective David Miller, turned their attention back to Emily and Jack's lives. The teenagers had deliberately misled their families and friends about their destination. The lie was a powerful clue, a testament to the fact they were running from something, or toward something. Miller believed the answer lay not in the forest, but in their personal history. He reopened the interviews, this time with a more pointed line of questioning. He wasn't just asking about their personalities, he was asking about their secrets. The focus of this new round of interviews centered on Emily's recent relationship with a boy named Mark. He was a volunteer for the Park Service, a young man a few years older than Emily and Jack, known for his deep knowledge of the park's lesser-traveled trails. Friends and classmates mentioned that Emily and Mark had a brief but intense relationship a few months before her disappearance. The romance had ended abruptly, leaving a palpable tension between the 2. Jack, according to his friends, had confronted Mark, but the details were vague. The consensus was that Mark had a temper, and the breakup had been messy. Miller felt a cold trail begin to warm. He tracked down Mark, who was now working at a different park in Northern California. The Park Service volunteer was initially cooperative, but his answers were guarded. He admitted to knowing Emily and Jack, to having a brief history with Emily, and to having seen them both in the park a few days before they were due back home. But he insisted he hadn't seen them since and had no knowledge of their plans to run away. His alibi for the weekend of the disappearance seemed solid, backed by fellow volunteers who confirmed he had been on a multi-day patrol in a different section of the park. Miller, however, noticed a tell. Mark's eyes, when talking about Emily, held a flash of something more than a former flame. There was a possessiveness, a bitterness. It was subtle, but it was there. The investigators, armed with a warrant, examined Jack's phone records, which had been collected at the beginning of the investigation. They were looking for anything related to Mark. They found a series of deleted text messages between Jack and a friend, exchanged in the days leading up to the trip. Jack had confided in his friend that he was worried about Mark. He had written that he saw Mark's car in a remote part of the park, near where the map now pointed, and that he was worried Mark might be following them. The messages painted a picture of a young man on edge, a young man who was not only planning to run away, but was also concerned for his and Emily's safety. The messages were fragmented and cryptic. hinting at something bigger than a simple lover's quarrel. Jack wasn't just planning a romantic escape with Emily, he was running from a perceived threat. And the new evidence suggested that threat might be Mark. The investigation shifted again, this time from a simple search for two teenagers to a focused look at a potential stalker and a motive for a crime. The discovery of Jack's deleted messages created a powerful new lead, but it also opened a new line of questioning. Mark's alibi was still solid, placing him far from the campsite on the night of the disappearance. But the messages revealed a hidden dimension to the trip, a fear, a sense of being pursued. Investigators, now more convinced than ever that the campsite held the key, returned to the remote location with a larger team and a more advanced set of tools. They weren't just looking for clues anymore. They were looking for a story. The forensic team, led by a seasoned specialist, began a more meticulous excavation of the campsite. They sectioned off the area, sifting through the soil and examining every leaf and rock. Underneath a tarp that had been used to cover firewood, they found it, a waterproof plastic container, sealed and tucked away. It contained a small, leather-bound notebook. Emily's name was embossed on the cover in a delicate cursive font. Inside, written in her neat handwriting, was a diary of the couple's last days. The entries in the notebook weren't filled with the usual teenage musings about boys or school. Instead, they were a meticulous, almost desperate account of a plan. Emily wrote about her anxieties, her fear of not living up to her parents' expectations, and her desire to escape the suffocating pressure of her small-town life. She detailed her and Jack's shared dream of a new beginning, of finding a quiet town somewhere out west and starting over, free from the expectations of their families. They had spent months saving money from their summer jobs, secretly buying camping gear and a burner phone. The trip to Sequoia National Park was a diversion, a way to throw everyone off their scent. They had planned to abandon their truck in the park and meet someone who could help them disappear. Emily's words painted a picture of a calculated escape, not a reckless joyride. The map found in Jack's sleeping bag was not for a scenic hike. It was the final leg of their journey. The second circled point, deep in the mountains, was their rendezvous point, a place where they would meet a person who, for an undisclosed fee, would provide them with a new vehicle and a new identity. The name of this person was not mentioned, only a cryptic code word: the guide. The last entry in the notebook was dated the day of their planned departure from the campsite. It was short, a few lines of hurried text. Emily wrote about a growing sense of dread, a feeling that they were being watched. She wrote that the guide had contacted them with a change of plans, instructing them to leave the campsite and meet him earlier than expected. She ended the entry with a sense of unease, a feeling that something wasn't right. The person they were meant to trust seemed to be a source of new anxiety, not relief. Her words ended abruptly, leaving the reader with a terrifying cliffhanger, a chilling silence that spoke louder than any scream. The diary confirmed what the map had already hinted. Their disappearance was carefully planned. The handwritten notes detailing their plan to escape and the cryptic mention of the guide gave the police and David Miller a tangible lead. The focus of the search shifted from a sprawling, aimless search for two lost teens to a methodical hunt for a single remote location. The second circled point on the map, the rendezvous point Emily mentioned in her diary, was now the sole objective. The location was nestled deep in the mountains in a section of the park so rugged and isolated that it rarely saw human activity. A small team, comprised of 2 experienced park rangers and 2 deputies, was assembled to make the difficult trek. They were equipped with satellite phones, GPS units, and enough provisions for a multi-day hike. The journey was arduous, a constant battle against steep inclines, thick undergrowth, and loose rock. The landscape was unforgiving, a stark contrast to the manicured trails of the main park. Every step was a reminder of just how determined Emily and Jack must have been to reach this place. After 2 days of relentless hiking, they finally reached the coordinates. What they found was not a clearing or a pre-arranged campsite, but a dilapidated old cabin. It was an abandoned fire lookout, long forgotten and left to the elements. The wooden structure was weathered and sagging, its windows boarded up with splintered planks. The door hung precariously on a single hinge. The interior was shrouded in darkness, the air thick with the smell of decay and dust. As they entered, the deputies were immediately struck by the scene. The cabin was not empty. A small portable camping stove sat on a makeshift table, a half-empty can of soup beside it. There was a thin mattress on the floor, covered with a sleeping bag, and a few discarded energy bar wrappers. This was a place where someone had recently stayed. The forensic specialists began their work, carefully documenting and bagging every item. They found a few empty boxes of over-the-counter painkillers, and then a crucial piece of evidence. Tucked under the mattress, a small, folded piece of paper. It was a note, written in Emily's handwriting, but it was unfinished. The note was short and frantic. It spoke of fear, of a profound sense of unease. Emily wrote that she and Jack had met with the guide, but that he wasn't what they had expected. She wrote that he was aggressive and threatening, and that he had changed the rules of their agreement. She wrote that she was scared, that she didn't know what to do. The note ended abruptly, a sentence trailing off in the middle, a sign that whatever interrupted her had been sudden and terrifying. The final sentence, incomplete and chilling, was, "He said we have to stay here until he comes back, but I don't think he's coming back for us." The discovery of this note shifted the case again, from a search for 2 missing teenagers who were running away to a full-blown criminal investigation, a race against time to find 2 young people who had gone into the wilderness seeking freedom and had instead found something much more sinister. The hunters had now become the hunted. The discovery of Emily's unfinished note shifted the investigation into a new, more terrifying phase. The 2 teenagers hadn't simply run away. They had been lured into a trap. The person they referred to as the guide was no benevolent accomplice, but a dangerous predator. The case was now a manhunt, with the clock ticking for Emily and Jack, who were likely somewhere in the vast, unforgiving wilderness, alone and at the mercy of a person who had already shown his sinister intentions. The entire resources of the sheriff's department, along with David Miller's private efforts, were mobilized to identify and locate this mysterious figure. The investigators returned to the cabin, meticulously combing through the area for any sign of a struggle, a clue that might have been overlooked. The forensic team focused on the few pieces of evidence they had: the energy bar wrappers, the can of soup, and the mattress. They were able to lift a few partial fingerprints, but the prints were not in any of their databases. The most promising lead was the discovery of a small, rusty metal button, the kind used on a jacket or a pair of jeans, half buried in the soil near the cabin's entrance. The button was not a match for any of the couple's clothing. It was a new piece of a very old puzzle. David Miller, now a de facto member of the investigation, decided to re-interview Mark, the park volunteer. Mark's alibi had held up, but his suspicious behavior had always nagged at Miller. This time, Miller didn't approach him as a potential suspect. He approached him as a witness. Miller presented Mark with Emily's note, showing him the unfinished, panicked writing. Mark's facade cracked. The bitterness and anger from their previous meeting were replaced by a genuine fear. He confessed He had seen them, but not on the trails. He had seen them at the abandoned cabin. Mark explained that he knew the cabin, a relic from his grandfather's days as a ranger. He had been doing an unauthorized solo patrol in that remote area, hoping to find solitude and clear his head after his breakup with Emily. He had stumbled upon the teenagers at the cabin and saw them talking to an older man, a stranger with a long beard and a distinctively styled vintage pickup truck. Mark described the man's demeanor as aggressive, his voice loud and demanding. He was about to approach them, to confront them, but he was afraid. He was afraid of Jack, and he was afraid of the stranger. He saw the stranger grab Emily's arm, and he saw Jack push him away. The fight seemed to escalate, and Mark, in a moment of panic, fled, certain he would report the incident to a park ranger at the next opportunity. But his anxiety about the confrontation and his secret patrol kept him silent. He had reported what he saw to a fellow ranger, but had been brushed off as being dramatic. He had no idea the encounter was part of a larger, more sinister plan. Mark's information was a game changer. The investigators now had a description of a suspect and, most importantly, a detailed description of his vehicle. An old, beat-up, dark-colored pickup truck with a large, distinctive dent in the front fender. They now had a path forward. The search was no longer for two teenagers lost in the woods, but for a dangerous man who had likely kidnapped them. The hunt for the guide had officially begun. The quiet, peaceful mountains had now become the hunting ground for a desperate and dangerous search. The hope for the couple's safe return, which had almost been extinguished, flickered back to life, fueled by the terrifying realization of what they were up against. The new information from Mark, the park volunteer, transformed the investigation from a passive, months-long cold case into a high-stakes manhunt. The description of the guide, a long-bearded man in a dark, vintage pickup truck with a distinct dent, was concrete. It was no longer a matter of searching for two lost teenagers, but of tracking a dangerous individual who had abducted them. All regional law enforcement agencies were immediately put on alert. A BOLO, a Be on the Lookout bulletin, was issued for the vehicle, and a description of the man was circulated, but it was vague and offered little beyond the physical description. The vast network of rural highways and back roads made the search a challenge, a frustrating exercise in looking for one specific vehicle among thousands. The investigation needed more than just a description of a truck. It needed a name, a location, a motive. The detectives, with Miller's help, returned to the minutiae of the evidence, re-examining everything they had found at the two campsites. They went back to the first campsite, the one with the empty candy wrapper. For months, it had been a baffling, almost nonsensical detail, a piece of trash left behind that seemed to serve no purpose. But with the new focus, they realized it might be a clue. The wrapper, a distinctive brand of a hard caramel candy, was sent for a more thorough forensic analysis. The results were surprising. The candy was not a national brand. It was a specialty item, produced by a small, regional confectioner in an adjacent state. This information was a crucial link. It led the investigators to a few local stores and diners that sold the unique treat. Miller and a deputy began to canvass these locations, showing a sketch of the suspect and the picture of the specific candy wrapper. Their search led them to a small, Greasy Spoon diner on a two-lane highway, a place where locals and truckers often stopped. The diner's owner, a woman named Shirley, recognized the candy immediately. She had sold it for years. When they showed her the sketch of the long-bearded man, her eyes narrowed in recognition. She knew him. He was a regular, a man who lived in a remote, off-the-grid cabin several miles from the highway. She knew him by his first name, Arthur, and she remembered his truck, an old beat-up Ford with a big dent in the passenger side fender. She even mentioned a peculiar habit he had of always paying with cash and how he would often talk to himself. Arthur Finch. The investigators now had a name. They cross-referenced his name with local records and found he had a history of minor offenses, trespassing, hunting out of season, but nothing that suggested a violent criminal past. His address led them to a parcel of land in a secluded, densely wooded area. It was the kind of place where a person could disappear, a place where a person could hold someone against their will without being discovered. The police, now with a warrant, began to prepare a raid. They moved with caution, recognizing the potential for danger. Arthur Finch was a survivalist, a man who knew the woods, a man who had already proven he was willing to use violence to get what he wanted. The investigation was no longer a cold case. It was a tactical operation. The long, frustrating months of searching had finally led them to a single, terrifying destination. The race to save Emily and Jack had reached its final, most perilous stage. The silent forest was about to give up its secrets. The operation to apprehend Arthur Finch commenced at dawn. 2 tactical teams composed of sheriffs and special agents moved towards his cabin from 2 different routes. The path was challenging, with no clear trails, and every step was a stark reminder of just how isolated a life this man had chosen to live. As they neared the cabin, they proceeded with maximum caution, fully anticipating armed resistance. Finch was known for his paranoia, and it was clear he wouldn't surrender without a fight. The cabin was a squat, low-lying structure, hidden amongst dense trees, as if it were a natural part of the forest itself. There were no signs of civilization, only a thick, impenetrable thicket of trees. The team leader gave the signal to breach. A moment later, the cabin door was kicked in. The expected resistance never materialized. Inside, the cabin was empty. No Arthur Finch, no Emily, no Jack. The cabin was abandoned, but recently. The space was cluttered, but not in the way one would expect from a recluse. There were maps of the park, scattered everywhere, covered in pencil markings and arrows. On one wall hung newspaper clippings about various conspiracy theories. In the corner sat an old radio, tuned to the frequencies of news channels. Finch wasn't just a hermit. He was a paranoid individual who had been closely following the outside world. The most crucial discovery was an old, battered journal. It was not a simple diary, but Finch's manifesto, filled with disjointed thoughts and paranoid theories. He wrote about the government watching him, that they wanted to take his land. Amidst all this chaos, investigators found a mention of the 2 children. He wrote that they had been sent to test him, to infiltrate his life. He initially believed they were part of the conspiracy, but over time, his entries changed. He began to write about them as his followers, that they too wanted to escape the system. At the very end of the journal was an entry made just a few days prior. He wrote that they had found him, and that they needed to leave immediately. He mentioned an old hunting shelter high in the mountains, far from any roads. This was a new, completely unexpected twist. Finch had fled, and by all accounts, he had taken Emily and Jack with him. The investigators now had a new objective, not just to find Finch, but to track him to the very heart of the mountains. The note in the journal was the last lead, the last chance to find the teenagers alive. The cryptic entry in Arthur Finch's journal, an old hunting shelter high in the mountains, gave the search a new, more terrifying urgency. The investigators knew they were no longer looking for a campsite. They were looking for a hideout, A tactical team bolstered by expert trackers and David Miller began the grueling ascent. The location was remote, in a section of the park so rugged it was almost untouched by human trails. They consulted old topographical maps and historical records, searching for any mention of a hunting shelter or a trapper's cabin. The journey was a brutal, relentless climb. The terrain was unforgiving, a tangle of jagged rocks and dense undergrowth. The weather had turned cold, adding another layer of misery to their mission. Every step was a battle, a desperate race against time and the elements. The trackers, however, were able to find faint, almost indiscernible signs of passage. A broken branch, a disturbed rock, a scuffed patch of moss, tiny clues that pointed in the right direction. It was a testament to Finch's skill as a survivalist that his trail was so hard to follow, a testament to his paranoia that he had chosen a path so difficult. Then they found it, tucked behind a large boulder, a small piece of fabric snagged on a thorny bush. It was a faded piece of nylon, torn and frayed. Miller immediately recognized the color and the material. It was a piece of Emily's missing backpack. Its presence here, far from their abandoned campsite, confirmed that Finch had taken them. The discovery was a powerful mix of relief and dread. They were on the right path, but it was also a stark reminder of the danger Emily and Jack were in. Hours later, as the sun began to set, the lead tracker paused, pointing to a small depression in the landscape. Barely visible against the darkening sky was a crude stone and log structure, half hidden by a cluster of trees. It was the hunting shelter. The relief that swept through the team was palpable, but it was quickly replaced by a sense of dread. The shelter was silent, a dark, foreboding shape in the approaching twilight. They moved cautiously, weapons at the ready, knowing that what they were about to find could be a rescue or a new, terrible end to their search. The final phase of the manhunt had arrived. The small team moved in on the hunting shelter, weapons raised. The silence was absolute, a heavy, oppressive blanket. The leader kicked the door open, and the team flooded inside, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. The scene that greeted them was one of profound relief and immediate action. Emily and Jack were there, huddled together on a makeshift bed of pine needles and old blankets. They were thin and weak, their faces pale and streaked with dirt, but they were alive. The relief was short-lived, replaced by a renewed sense of urgency. The teenagers were in a state of shock, but they were conscious. The medical team immediately began to assess their condition, providing food and water. As they slowly began to recover, they started to tell their story. Finch had not abandoned them. He had been forced to flee. He had seen the police vehicles from a distant ridge, his paranoia confirmed. In a desperate panic, he had given them a small amount of food and water, telling them to stay put, that he would be back for them. But as Emily had suspected in her note, he never intended to return. The debriefing was immediate, a high-stakes conversation conducted as the teenagers were being treated. They confirmed Finch's paranoia, his belief that the government was closing in on him. They explained that they had initially tried to play along, hoping to escape at the first opportunity. But he was too vigilant. They also provided a crucial new detail. In his panicked state, Finch had left behind a small, handwritten map. It wasn't a map of the park, but a crude, hand-drawn sketch of a remote area far to the east, across the state line. It was an old logging trail that led to a small, isolated farm. Finch had talked about a friend there, a person who could help him disappear for good. The search had now moved from the dense wilderness to a specific and potentially more dangerous destination. Finch had a plan, an escape route, and a partner. The relief of finding the teenagers was immense, but it was quickly overshadowed by the chilling reality that the manhunt was not over. It had just begun its final, most perilous chapter. The investigators, with this new information, knew they were now chasing a desperate man who had nothing left to lose. The pursuit was on. The finish line was within sight, but the final terrifying confrontation still loomed ahead. The new, hastily drawn map found with Emily and Jack was the final and most critical key to the puzzle. The map led not through the trails of the national park, but along an old, abandoned logging road that crossed the state line and ended at a remote farm. This was not just an address. It was Arthur Finch's last chance at salvation, a place where, in his mind, he could disappear forever. The investigation moved from the snowy mountains to the flatter, overgrown forests of the neighboring state. Local police, receiving the information, quickly joined the operation. They knew these lands, knew who lived in these remote areas. From the description of Finch, they quickly identified the person in question. A man named Sam Walker, an old friend of Finch's, known for his isolated views and love for seclusion. Walker lived on his farm, surrounded by thick forest, and rarely ventured into town. He was just as paranoid as Finch, and that made him the ideal accomplice. The apprehension operation, carefully planned and coordinated between the two states, began at dawn. The team, including detectives, tactical officers, and David Miller, moved slowly and cautiously towards Walker's farm. The old, broken road shown on Finch's map was barely visible beneath a layer of snow and fallen leaves. Every step brought them closer to their goal, and with each step the tension grew. They knew they would be facing two armed and dangerous men, cornered and desperate. Approaching the farm, they saw a dilapidated barn with a sagging roof. Behind the barn, hidden from the road, sat Finch's vehicle. The old, beat-up pickup truck with the distinct dent on the fender. It was an irrefutable sign they were at the right place. The team split up. One group surrounded the house, the other the barn. Miller, along with the lead detective, approached the house. It was quiet, with no signs of life. The detective knocked on the door. Silence. When they entered, the house was empty. The inside was dirty, but not in the way they expected. Plates and canned goods were scattered everywhere, and Finch's open bag lay on the floor. It was clear their stay here had been sudden, and they too had apparently been waiting for someone. But where were Finch and Walker, and where had the pickup truck they had seen earlier gone? Upon searching the barn, they found another hastily drawn map. It marked a narrow passage deep into the woods, which led to a secret bunker. The map was inscribed with a message: "Heading for cover, will return when it's safe." This was a new, unexpected twist. Finch and Walker were in hiding, but they hadn't fled. They were waiting, and that was far more dangerous than a simple escape. The final chapter of this story had not yet been written. The revelation of the bunker beneath the barn solidified the team's strategy. They were no longer pursuing two desperate men through the woods. They were laying siege to a hidden stronghold. The small, elite team, including David Miller, moved with a quiet, lethal precision. They surrounded the bunker's hidden entrance, a camouflaged metal hatch tucked away under a pile of logs and brush. The atmosphere was thick with tension, every sound, every rustle of the wind a potential threat. They knew Finch and Walker were inside, armed, paranoid, and likely with no intention of surrendering peacefully. The tactical leader issued the command to breach. A loud, sharp bang echoed through the silent forest as the hatch was forced open. Grenades were deployed, not for destruction, but to disorient the occupants with a blinding flash and deafening sound. The team descended into the darkness. The air inside the bunker was stale and heavy, a mix of damp earth and stale food. The space was small and cramped, filled with supplies, cans of food, water jugs, and ammunition. In the farthest corner, huddled behind a makeshift barrier of crates, were Finch and Walker. They were both armed, their faces a mixture of fear and defiance. They had expected an attack, but not this. Their paranoid worldview, which had once been a source of comfort, now became their greatest weakness. They were so consumed by the idea of an attack that they hadn't considered the possibility of being trapped. They saw the flashlights, the tactical gear, the determined faces of the officers, and they knew their flight was over. They had nowhere left to run. The standoff was brief, with no escape route, no hostages, and a full team of armed and determined officers. Their options were non-existent. They laid down their weapons, their resistance crumbling under the weight of their own desperation. They were taken into custody without a shot fired. The long, terrifying ordeal was finally over. The capture of Finch and Walker brought a chilling end to the mystery. They confessed to their crimes, their motives a tangle of paranoia, conspiracy theories, and misplaced loyalty. Finch had lured Emily and Jack to the cabin, intending to use them to get new identities and escape what he believed was a government conspiracy against him. Walker was his accomplice, a man who shared his worldview and helped him with the logistical side of his plan. The relief of the families was immense, a cathartic release after months of agonizing uncertainty. Emily and Jack were safe, their harrowing ordeal over. The investigation, which had started as a simple missing persons case and evolved into a complex manhunt, was finally closed. The story of two teenagers who had tried to escape their lives and had instead stumbled into a dark, terrifying plot became a cautionary tale, a reminder that the quiet, peaceful wilderness could hold secrets, and that sometimes the real monsters were not in the shadows, but in plain sight.